going on in the world of drug laws? In Mexico, the Supreme Court has opened the door to legalizing marijuana, while in Ireland there's a radical new plan to decriminalise the use of marijuana, heroin and cocaine. But perhaps most surprisingly, last month the United States government announced the early release from prison of 6,000 non-violent drug offenders. So, more than 4 decades after US President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, is it finally time for a new approach? To debate this, I'm joined by the British journalist Johann Hari, author of a best-selling book on the drug war called Chasing the Scream, and from Salt Lake City, Utah, Ernest, Istook, a former Republican congressman who sat on the Homeland Security Committee. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me in the arena. Johann, the subtitle of your book refers to the last days of the war on drugs. Given the recent announcements in Ireland, in Mexico, here in the US too, are we living through those last days right now in your view?
It totally depends on what we do now. It's now 100 years since we first banned drugs, and the reason why I wanted to look into this is because one of my earliest memories was of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And as I got older, I realised we had drug addiction in my family, and I wanted to figure out what would genuinely reduce the problems caused by drugs and the problems associated with it. So I went to the places that have fought the drug war hardest, and I went to the places that have fully decriminalised or legalised drugs, and the difference was really striking. The places that are fighting the drug war hard have worse and worse problems, and every year they get worse. And the places that have decriminalised and legalised are seeing those problems really significantly diminish. We've got to look at the real world at some point.
Ernest, Istook, Portugal, Holland, Switzerland, they've all decriminalised marijuana use. Ireland and Mexico look like they're about to follow them. Uruguay's legalised it. Here in the United States, 20 states have legalised it for medical use, 4 states for recreational use. Do you feel you've been left behind by events, that your kind of war on drugs perspective is now a minority perspective?
No, I'm not about to surrender my judgment to Mr. Hari's personal opinions or his anecdotal observations. Nationally, the 2 most prevalent drugs, the illegal drugs, and of course alcohol, combined have about a $500 billion negative impact on the United States economy, and it's pretty well equally split between alcohol and illegal drugs. We have 500,000 people going to emergency rooms here in the USA each year because of the impact of their marijuana use.
So why
we have families that find people can't hold a job properly. They don't provide the nurturing for their children because they spend too much time getting high.
So why do you think there is this trend now across many parts of the world, including in the US, towards decriminalisation and liberalisation? Isn't that because informed people are saying the current setup doesn't work?
No, it's because people are not being well informed. We have a media, especially here in the USA, that tends to go toward the liberalizing of things, especially when it comes to personal behaviors, the decline in focus on self-responsibility, the elevation by the media of saying, oh, the notion of being free is being able to do things and not worry about the negative impact that it has on your family, on society. Just look at the studies that have come out in the last year about the permanent brain damage that's caused by adolescent use, and that's up to age 25 of marijuana.
Congressman Istook is totally right.
The negative impacts are rarely reported.
Congressman Istook is absolutely right that addiction is something that doesn't just affect the individual, it affects the whole family. I've seen that in my own life. That's precisely why we have to choose policies that genuinely reduce addiction as opposed to policies that increase them. Let's look at, you see, if we talk about it in the abstract, you can say any old rubbish and it'll sound plausible. Let's talk about a real place. Portugal in the year 2000 had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin. And every year they tried Congressman Istook's method more and more. They arrested more people, they imprisoned more people, and every year the problem got worse, until finally they got a panel of scientists and doctors to look at the best evidence. And the panel came back and said, decriminalise all drugs from cannabis to crack, but, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we currently spend on making users and addicts' lives worse and spend it instead on turning their lives around.
I don't think that's an adequate description of what Portugal is doing.
Just to give you the results, it's been 15 years. The results are very clear. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal by 50%.
You misdescribe what Portugal is doing.
50%. You know, I went and interviewed a man called João Figueira. He was the top drug cop in Portugal. He said everything Congressman Istook said when they did the decriminalisation. And when I met him, he said everything I said would happen didn't happen.
No, don't tell me that person singled me out by name. No, he doesn't know what I think.
He was talking about the broader arguments that you're putting
forward. If you look at the so-called war on drugs in the United States right now, the largest single expenditure is on treatment. At the federal level, something
absurd.
like $10 billion
Absurd
a year.
claim.
40% of these numbers come from the White House. From the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy.
Which is not a
40% of the money we spend on drug war in the United States is on treatment. $10 billion, okay? So we are going with that. Now, you misdescribed what Portugal is doing. Portugal has not legalized the use of drugs.
I said decriminalised? I said decriminalised?
And in fact...
Have you ever been to Portugal, Congressman?
Here's a question for you, Johann. You talk about that crime will come down, that we'll be able to solve some of the criminal problems around drugs if we decriminalise or in cases legalise. Isn't that a kind of utopian view in the sense that a lot of these cartels now, they make a lot of their money from people smuggling, from illegal mining, from organ trafficking. I mean, criminals are not going to stop being criminals simply because you take drugs out of the sphere of illegality, are they?
Oh, sure. If you took the iPhone away from Apple, Apple wouldn't go bankrupt, but it would lose a huge share of its business. You've got to understand the dynamic that's happening here. If you imagine, if we stepped out of here now and we decided to steal a bottle of vodka, and that store caught us, they'd call the cops would take us away. That store doesn't need to be violent, it doesn't need to be intimidating. If we tried to steal a bag of cannabis or a bag of cocaine, obviously the guy selling that can't ring the police would arrest him. He has to fight us. In fact, he has to establish his place in that neighbourhood through violence and intimidation.
The war on drugs
creates
a war for drugs. I don't know what you're saying has any relevance to the huge national problem here in the U.S.
I'll explain to you. I'll explain to you the relevance.
I understand why you don't understand it. Costing families about $250 billion a year. When children aren't nurtured, when you keep going this cycle, this interrelationship between poverty and drug use.
I'm not going to take lectures. I'm not going to take lectures on
somebody has
brain damage. Family with addiction.
Well, I'm not going to take lectures from you, sir.
Look at what happened at the end of alcohol prohibition, right? When the drug is banned, it's transferred to armed criminal gangs. They go to war to control it. Today, does the head of Heineken go and shoot the head of Smirnoff in the face? Of course not. Nothing has changed about the drug. Alcohol is the same drug it always was. This causes an enormous amount of violence. Mexico, I spent a lot of time in Mexico researching for my book. The catastrophe there caused entirely by this policy.
You make it sound like the more drugs we legalize, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, that's in fact what I think.
Is there a danger that you're a little bit too relaxed about the upsides of legalisation, decriminalisation, and turning a blind eye to what will be downsides? I mean, The Guardian, a liberal left newspaper, when they reviewed your book, they said to you, the ubiquitous, irredeemable misery raked by the savage entwinement of abject poverty and drug use. It's not always positive, is it?
I don't think he could have read my book, because there's about 3 chapters about that whole question. We've got to... the tragedies caused by drug abuse are things that I've seen play out in my own life. There's absolutely no dispute about that. The question is, do we spend the money we have punishing, shaming, stigmatizing those users and making their lives worse, in which case their addiction gets worse, because addiction is caused by the pain in your heart and isolation. Or do we spend that money on making their lives significantly better? When Portugal did that, when they invested that money in a huge job creation program...
Do you want people who are in poverty to spend all their time getting high rather than getting out of poverty?
No.
Is that what you're proposing?
No.
So
anyone who's read anything I've ever said knows that's the opposite.
By drugs.
Have you ever heard the phrase straw man? Have you ever heard the phrase straw man?
You want to...
Ernest, you mentioned... Hold on, Johann, hold on, Johann, hold on. Ernest, you mentioned poverty and the impact on families and communities. One of the major reasons, especially in the United States, that people are very critical of the drug war is they see it as being racist. They see that certain communities are being disproportionately targeted. Surely you, as a former legislator, must recognise that there is this huge imbalance in terms of arrests, prosecutions between white drug users and black drug users. That is part of the backdrop of this war on drugs.
The imbalance, 1, exists, but 2, it's based upon behavior, not being based upon prejudice.
So when black people are 4 times more likely than white people, when black people are nearly 4 times more likely than white people to be arrested on charges of marijuana possession, according to the ACLU, despite data suggesting they use the drug at the same rate, is that not racist?
Well, again, I'm not going to adopt the ACLU. I'd rather look at the Justice Department numbers that show that disparity is based upon behavior, not upon prejudice.
We can hear how grotesque this is.
Disparity in the rates of use. That's
the data from Human Rights Watch suggests otherwise. Johann, do you believe the drug war is fundamentally... I mean, where does race play a role in view when you've come up as a critic?
It's not about my opinion or Congressman Istook's position. I spoke to lots of police officers who would talk about how they would only ever go to African-American neighbourhoods to do drug busts. One of the people, actually not someone I spoke to, but someone who's spoken elsewhere, a guy called Matthew Fogg, went to his boss one day and said, "Hey boss, how come we only ever go to black neighbourhoods to bust people? I'm pretty sure white people use drugs as well." And his boss said something like, Yeah, you're right, but white people get lawyers, they know judges, they know journalists. We'll just go for the low-hanging fruit. The effect is overwhelmingly racist.
Well, I hope
As
you've
anyone who
reported
lives
that
in the United
individual
States
by name and jurisdiction so somebody can do something about it, rather than you just give an anonymous anecdotal quote.
It's not anonymous, I just gave his name. Bizarre.
Last word to both of you.
Crucial thing to say about Congressman Istook's approach is we have given it a fair shot. 100 years, $1 trillion, hundreds of thousands of people have died. At the end of all that, we can't even keep drugs out of our prisons. This model can never work. There are alternatives that have been tried that do work. And I just want to say one very quick thing. When he talks about compassion for families, this is a man who was in favour of putting the mothers and fathers of those families in prison. Don't believe it.
Hold on. Ernest Istook, last word.
You're lying. You are lying when you say that I'm trying to put casual drug users in prison.
Are you in favour of
Hold on,
putting drug addicts in prison?
I made it clear the people that go to prison are the dealers.
Look it up. Anyone can look this up. That is factually untrue.
Don't give me a 100-year figure.
You're saying there are no drug users or addicts in America?
Allow him to make his point, Johann. You made your point. Let me make his point.
The annual figure from the federal government is approximately $35–40 billion, of which 40% is on treatment. So the cost of the war on drugs is not what you make it out to be. So don't tie together 100 years worth of numbers and throw them out and make it sound like that's what we spend every year. It's not true.
Ernest Istook, Johann Hari, thanks for joining me both. We're out of time. Appreciate you being here in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.